Chapter 1. The House by the Sea. She stood in my kitchen, smiling like she belonged there, and said, "Soon this house will be ours." For a moment, I thought I misheard her, but the look in her eyes wasn't love, it was ownership. Days later, I found our names gone from every bill, every document, every trace of our life. That was the moment I realized, kindness, without boundaries, can destroy you. I never imagined that the sound of the ocean could feel so heavy. For 40 years, that constant rhythm of waves against the Monterey cliffs had been my peace, my soundtrack to a life built on quiet love and hard work. Linda and I bought this house when we were newlyweds, before gray hair and arthritis set in, before the world moved so fast that people stopped looking each other in the eye. We raised our son here. We built our life brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, and when I retired at 68, I thought the rest of our days would pass in calm, just us and the sea. When Michael called to say he needed help, it felt natural to say yes. He had been laid off during the pandemic, one of many in the long list of lost jobs and broken routines of that year. He sounded tired, and for the first time since he was a boy, there was something fragile in his voice. He said he needed a place to figure things out, just for a little while. Of course he would bring his wife, Vanessa, and their little boy, Ethan, who had just turned 2. Linda was thrilled. She spent the next week preparing as if we were expecting royalty. She aired out the guest room, replaced the bedding, scrubbed the kitchen until the counters shined. I watched her work, humming along with the old radio, silver hair pinned loosely back. She kept saying how nice it would be to have laughter in the house again. I smiled, not wanting to say aloud that peace had its own kind of laughter too. When they arrived, the house was full again. Michael carried boxes and hugged me briefly. Ethan clung to Vanessa's shoulder, wide-eyed at the big space and the sound of the waves through the open windows. Vanessa smiled brightly, that kind of camera-ready smile that never quite reached her eyes. She thanked Linda for everything, calling her Mom Linda, with sugary warmth. I thought maybe she really was as sweet as she sounded. The first few days were fine. The mornings were noisy but happy. Linda cooked big breakfasts. Michael helped fix the old deck railing, and Vanessa set up her laptop in the dining room, saying she had to post updates for her followers. I didn't mind. It felt like family again. Linda adored having Ethan around, teaching him to water the plants and chasing him around the garden. But small things began to shift. I noticed it the way you notice a crack in the paint. Subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once you've seen it. One morning, the furniture in the living room was rearranged. The recliner where I'd read my newspaper for 20 years was shoved to the corner. The family photos were replaced with soft-colored decor that matched Vanessa's online aesthetic. When I asked about it, she laughed, saying the space just needed to flow better for content. Then it was the meals. Linda had always cooked from the heart, the kind of simple, heavy food that fills both stomach and soul. Suddenly salt was unhealthy, butter was outdated, and Linda's meatloaf was replaced by avocado wraps. Vanessa smiled as she spoke, always polite, always firm, and always in control. Michael would glance at me but never said a word. When I tried to joke that I missed real food, he shrugged. "She just wants everyone to eat better, Dad." I started spending more time in the yard, fixing things that didn't need fixing. The sea breeze was cooler out there, quieter too. I could hear Linda through the kitchen window, her voice softer now, agreeing to things she never would have before. One afternoon, I came home from a walk and heard voices in the living room. Vanessa was recording herself, ring light glowing, baby on her hip. She spoke to her camera with perfect warmth. "We're settling into our beautiful coastal home, making memories by the ocean." "Our beautiful home?" she said. I froze in the doorway, not sure if I had heard her right. She ended the recording, looked up, and smiled at me. "Just talking about how grateful we are, Dad." That night, Linda said nothing at dinner. She just looked down at her plate, quiet. I tried to lighten the mood. "You okay?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "She means well," she said softly. "She just has a way of making everything hers." A few days later, Linda was arranging flowers in the living room. She loved doing that every morning, cutting fresh blooms from the yard, filling the house with color. I was reading the paper when I heard Vanessa's sharp voice. "Don't touch my son's things." The sound of it sliced through the air. I lowered the paper. Linda was standing still, holding a vase, confused. "I'm just setting these here by the window," she said gently. Vanessa's expression was pure irritation. "His toys are there. I don't want them getting dirty." The words hung there. My wife, 70 years old, who had raised a child and kept a home spotless for decades, was being scolded like hired help. Linda's face flushed, and she stepped back without a word. The vase wobbled in her hands. I stood up slowly, my chest tight. Vanessa turned to me, her tone suddenly sweet. "I'm just being careful. You understand." I didn't answer. I could feel something shifting inside me, quiet but certain. That invisible line had been crossed. My home felt smaller in that moment, not because of the walls, but because of the way silence filled them. That night, after they went to bed, I sat on the porch alone. The waves still moved with the same rhythm, steady and endless, but they didn't sound peaceful anymore. I thought about how easily a house could stop feeling like home. All it took was a voice that didn't belong, and a silence that hurt too much to break. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that things would calm down, but deep down, I knew something had changed forever. Chapter 2. A guest in our own home. I began to notice that the house no longer sounded like ours. The rhythm of daily life had changed, small noises replaced by Vanessa's voice directing everything. She claimed it was about keeping the baby healthy, that cleanliness and routine were essential, but what it really did was push us aside. One morning she told us that for Ethan's naps to go smoothly, Linda and I should spend more time upstairs. She smiled politely as she said it, but her tone made it clear it was an order, not a suggestion. Michael stood beside her, quiet and compliant. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, but he only nodded as if it made sense. Linda didn't argue. She simply said, "Whatever helps the baby rest," and went upstairs with her knitting basket. At first, I tried to believe it was temporary, just part of the new parent phase, but as days passed, the space we occupied kept shrinking. We stopped eating in the kitchen because Vanessa said the smell of cooked food lingered too long. She began ordering pre-made meals, claiming it was easier for everyone. I found myself eating sandwiches in my workshop, listening to my wife hum softly from the upstairs hallway. Every evening the house echoed with Vanessa's voice giving instructions, soft but sharp. "Don't open that window, the baby's allergies. Please don't move that chair, it blocks the camera frame." I could see her setting up ring lights and tripods, walking around with her phone, narrating her life for people online. Once she asked me to turn off the television because the sound ruined her recording. I turned it off without a word, but something inside me twisted. Linda kept pretending nothing was wrong. She greeted Vanessa kindly, offered to help with laundry, tried to make peace in small ways. Each offer was politely declined. She'd return upstairs, still smiling but quieter every day. Our evenings, once spent together watching old westerns, were now silent. I started noticing the neighbors glancing over when they walked by. Sophie Delgado, who lived next door, mentioned one afternoon that she'd heard some shouting. "Everything all right over there, Henry?" she asked. I told her we were fine. She looked unconvinced. One afternoon, I came home early from the grocery store. The house was quiet except for Vanessa's voice coming from the living room. I stopped in the hallway and realized she was filming again. She moved around confidently, gesturing toward the walls, the sunlight, the furniture. "Welcome to our coastal life," she said cheerfully. "We're so blessed to have this beautiful home by the sea." Our home. The words hit like a punch. She smiled into the camera, moving from room to room as if she owned every inch. I watched her adjust a vase Linda had placed earlier, replacing it with a candle that matched her brand aesthetic. It was subtle, but it was deliberate. By the time she finished recording, I felt like a stranger standing in a museum that used to be my house. She didn't notice me at first. When she finally turned and saw me, she smiled brightly, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, Henry, just doing a little filming for my followers. They love seeing the house." I nodded slowly, forcing a polite smile, but inside I felt cold. That evening, Linda and I sat outside on the porch. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, but neither of us said much. After a long silence, she whispered, "It feels like we're visiting our own home." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The next morning, Vanessa approached us with that practiced sweetness. "I've been thinking," she said, holding the baby close. "It might be best if you two kept to the upstairs area during the day. The baby needs quiet, and all the movement around the house keeps him overstimulated." Linda's eyes flickered to mine. I could see the hurt behind her calm expression. "Of course," she said softly. "We don't want to disturb the baby." Vanessa smiled. "Thank you for understanding. It'll just make things easier for everyone." Michael was nearby, scrolling through his phone. I asked, "Do you agree with this, son?" He didn't look up. "It's temporary, Dad. Vanessa's just trying to keep things organized. You know how babies are." Organized. That word stuck in my mind all day. That night I went downstairs for water. The living room light was still on, and I heard Vanessa talking quietly. I thought she was on the phone with Michael until I caught a sentence that froze me. "We almost have the house now," she said, her voice low and certain. I stopped in the dark hallway, heart pounding. She laughed softly. "It's just a matter of time." I stayed still, listening, but she didn't say more. My throat felt dry. I backed away slowly, my feet careful on the old wooden stairs. Upstairs, Linda was asleep, her book folded on her chest. I stood by the window, watching the ocean beyond the dark yard, and felt the same weight I'd felt weeks before, only heavier. It wasn't just about space, or noise, or even respect anymore. Something deeper was shifting, something deliberate. I could feel it in the quiet corners of the house, in the way Vanessa walked through rooms that used to belong to us. That night, as the waves crashed against the shore, I sat awake listening to the creak of the old house and realized that peace was no longer possible. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to fade with time. It was growing, one small concession at a time, and I had no idea how far it would go. Chapter 3. The Invisible Distance. Michael started speaking to me like I was a guest, polite but distant, his words measured and cold. He called me sir once, half joking, but the sound of it stung. It wasn't just the way he talked, it was the way he avoided looking at me. Whenever I tried to talk about what was happening in the house, his eyes drifted away, landing on his phone or the floor. Vanessa's name slipped into every sentence, as if she had become the axis of his world. Linda noticed it too. "One morning over coffee," she said quietly, "he's slipping away from us." I told her he was just under stress, that losing his job and adjusting to fatherhood could make anyone distant. But I didn't believe my own words. The truth was, our son was disappearing into someone else's idea of family. Vanessa and Michael started eating dinner after us, claiming they needed a different schedule for the baby. They kept the downstairs lights dim and curtains drawn, as if privacy were a wall we weren't allowed to cross. I could hear them talking late at night, their voices muffled but tense. Once I caught fragments of their conversation drifting through the vent. Vanessa's voice was firm, almost scolding. "You need to stand your ground," she said. "They don't respect boundaries." Michael answered softly, "I know, but it's their house." Then she snapped, "Not for long if you'd stop feeling guilty." The next morning he couldn't meet my eyes. Linda began calling her old friend, Diane Cole, someone she'd known since her teaching days. Diane was now a reporter at a small local paper in Carmel. I overheard snippets of their conversations while I worked on the porch. Linda told her about the tension, about how Vanessa had slowly taken over every part of the house. Diane's voice carried through the phone, calm and measured, the kind of tone someone uses when they've heard it all before. She said there were many parents going through the same thing, slowly pushed out of their own homes by adult children who had forgotten gratitude. When Linda hung up, she sat quietly for a long time. I could see the weight of that truth pressing down on her shoulders. That evening she started keeping a journal, an old leather one she'd found in her dresser drawer. She said writing might help her think clearly. Sometimes she left it open on the nightstand. I wasn't trying to pry, but one night I glanced down and saw a single line written in her neat handwriting. When kindness is mistaken for weakness, that one sentence broke me. I'd always believed that patience solved everything, that quiet understanding was stronger than confrontation. But looking at her words, I realized silence had become our prison. Days blurred together after that. Vanessa continued ruling the house with a soft, calculated tone. She'd smile at Linda and me, thank us for helping, then proceed to tell us what we were allowed to do. The kitchen became off limits after noon. The living room was too cluttered for filming. Even the garden, Linda's pride and joy, was suddenly declared unsafe for the baby because of pollen. One afternoon, I came downstairs for a glass of water and found Vanessa scrubbing the counter with disinfectant. She looked up, startled, and said sharply, "Please don't touch that. I just cleaned." I froze mid-step. She forced a smile. "Sorry, I'm just trying to keep things organized." I walked back upstairs, the glass still empty. Linda was sitting by the window, her knitting untouched. I asked her if she wanted to go out for lunch. She shook her head. "Maybe later," she said softly. Her eyes looked tired. The journal sat open on her lap, a page half filled with small, trembling lines. That night, as I turned off the lights, I heard something fall in the hallway. Then a sharp sound, like a gasp. I rushed out and saw Linda on the stairs, one hand gripping the railing, the other clutching her knee. She was pale, her breath short. At the top of the stairs, Vanessa stood holding a folded blanket, expressionless. "What happened?" I asked. Linda winced and said she had slipped. Vanessa's voice was calm, almost cold. "She shouldn't be walking around when the lights are off. It's not safe." I looked at her, at the way she didn't move to help, and felt something dark coil inside me. I helped Linda to the couch, checked her knee, and fetched an ice pack. Vanessa disappeared into the kitchen without a word. Michael came out minutes later, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he mumbled. I told him his mother had fallen. He looked at Vanessa, then back at me. "Is she okay?" he asked. "She's fine," Vanessa said quickly. "Just careless, careless." That word burned into me. Linda whispered. "It's fine, Henry, let it go." But I couldn't. Later that night, when the house was silent again, I sat in the dark hallway, staring at the staircase, the same staircase I had built a handrail for years ago when Michael was little, to keep him safe. I could still see Linda's hand gripping it, her face pale from the shock. I walked into my small office, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old security camera I had used for the shed years ago. My hands shook as I cleaned off the dust. I wired it into the hallway corner, hidden near the vent. It wasn't about paranoia anymore. It was about proof. I needed to see what was really happening inside my home. As I adjusted the angle, I caught my reflection in the dark window glass. My eyes looked older than I remembered. There was something harder there, something that hadn't existed before. When I finally went to bed, Linda was asleep, breathing shallowly, her journal still open beside her. I looked at the last line she had written before drifting off. "The house used to feel alive. Now it feels watched." I turned off the light and lay awake, listening to the sound of the ocean beyond the walls, steady and cold, wondering when our home had stopped belonging to us, and when our silence had become the very thing destroying it. Chapter 4. Signs of a Scheme. A few mornings later, Linda stood by the kitchen counter, her brow furrowed as she flipped through the small pile of mail I had brought in. She looked up at me and asked softly why we hadn't seen any utility bills in weeks. I shrugged at first, thinking maybe they had been delayed, but she kept searching through the stack, her fingers trembling a little. There were coupons, credit card offers, a magazine we never subscribed to, but nothing that belonged to us. When Vanessa came into the room carrying Ethan, Linda asked again. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that always seemed to mean something else, and said she had switched all the bills to online payments. Easier that way, she explained. Everything was digital now, paperless, efficient. I nodded slowly, but something in her tone didn't sit right. Linda accepted the answer, though I could tell she didn't believe it either. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the mailbox again, pretending I had forgotten to check it earlier. The air was damp and smelled faintly of salt and eucalyptus. I opened the small metal door and saw 2 envelopes inside. Both were addressed to Vanessa Hart Wallace, not forwarded, not shared, not to the household, just her name. I stood there longer than I should have, the paper cool against my hands. The envelopes were from the electric company and the internet provider, both companies I had used for decades. I went back inside quietly and slipped them into my desk drawer. Before anyone saw, that evening, while Linda was upstairs reading to Ethan, I went down to the basement. The air was cool and dusty, the kind that carried the smell of years of memories. I opened the filing cabinet, where I kept insurance papers, property taxes, receipts, all the things a man collects to prove he built a life. As I sifted through the folders, my hand brushed against something unfamiliar, a stack of printed forms tucked neatly in the back. I pulled them out and held them under the light. Utility transfer requests, mail forwarding authorizations, all bearing Vanessa's name. Some had my address, but listed her as the primary resident. A few even had digital signatures where my name should have been. I felt my stomach drop. Each page was a small theft, not of money or property yet, but of identity. It was like someone slowly erasing the evidence of who belonged here. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the old water heater, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Linda found me sitting on the steps when she came downstairs. She saw the papers in my hands and frowned. "What is that?" she asked. I hesitated, then handed them to her. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. Her voice was barely a whisper when she said, "Henry, what is she doing?" I didn't know how to answer. I told her I would take care of it, that I just needed to understand first. She nodded, though I could see fear settling behind her eyes. The next day, while Vanessa and Michael were out shopping, I gathered every piece of mail from the past month, spread it across my desk, and started reading. More and more letters carried Vanessa's name. Some addressed her as the primary account holder. A few even used our home address with her listed as resident owner. I sat there staring at those words. Resident owner. I had lived in that house longer than Vanessa had been alive, yet somehow she was quietly writing herself into its foundation. That evening, as the sun went down, I told Linda I was going to visit an old friend. She didn't ask who. She just said, "Be careful," and handed me my jacket. I drove into town, the road winding along the cliffs, where the ocean glowed orange under the setting sun. Richard Cole's office sat above a small bakery on Lighthouse Avenue in Pacific Grove. He had been my college roommate back in San Jose, now a real estate attorney, with a sharp mind and a calm way of speaking that could settle anyone. He was older now, silver-haired like me, his office lined with books and framed degrees. He smiled when I walked in. "Henry Wallace," he said, "I was starting to think you'd fallen off the grid." We talked for a few minutes about family and retirement before I placed the stack of papers on his desk. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. His face changed as he went through the pages, first confusion, then concern. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "Henry," he said, "these forms are legitimate. She's not making empty gestures. By transferring utilities and mail in her name, she's establishing a record of residency. If this continues, she could claim tenant rights or even ownership claims if you ever left the property unattended." I felt heat rising in my chest. Ownership claims. How could someone take what wasn't theirs just because of paperwork? Richard raised a hand, his voice steady. "Don't confront her yet. The law is slow, but it's clear. If you confront her now, she might double down or cover her tracks. We need proof. Timestamps. A trail." He handed me a yellow notepad. "Start documenting everything, every bill, every letter, every interaction. Keep it dated, signed, private." Driving home that night, the road seemed darker than usual. The ocean to my right was hidden by fog, and for the first time in years, the sound of the waves felt like a warning instead of a comfort. When I walked into the house, the lights were low. Vanessa's laughter drifted from the living room, the kind of laugh people use when they know they're being listened to. Michael was on the couch beside her, his face relaxed, unaware of the storm building just beneath his own roof. Linda was sitting at the dining table, knitting in silence. She looked up at me, searching my face. I forced a small smile and said everything was fine, but she knew better. She always did. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall. Every second felt heavier, louder, more deliberate. Somewhere downstairs, the refrigerator hummed softly, the same rhythm it always had, but it sounded different now, almost like a warning pulse echoing through the walls of the house. I thought of Richard's words, of the stack of papers waiting in my desk drawer, and of Vanessa's calm smile whenever she spoke about keeping things organized. It wasn't organization, it was preparation, and if I was right, the woman living under my roof wasn't just taking over our space, she was building a case to take our home. Chapter 5. The net closes and I woke before sunrise and sat at the kitchen table with Richard's yellow notepad open in front of me. The pages were already filled with dates, times, and small details. Every bill that arrived in Vanessa's name, every change to the house, every moment that felt off. I wrote quietly, the pen scratching against paper, trying to turn my confusion into evidence. Linda came downstairs, still in her robe, holding a cup of coffee. She looked at the notepad but didn't ask what it was. Instead, she said softly that she had found something strange while checking our credit card statements. She slid a folded printout across the table. It showed a charge for camera equipment from a store in Los Angeles. A second charge followed, smaller, but for lighting gear. I knew right away it wasn't ours. She looked at me with a sad smile. "It's her vlog, Henry. She used our account." I felt my jaw tighten. Vanessa had access because Michael managed the online banking. I didn't want to believe he had allowed it, but the numbers didn't lie. That morning, I called Richard. He told me to stay calm, keep gathering evidence, and not alert her. His voice was steady, professional, the way someone speaks when they know a storm is building but can't stop it yet. Days passed in a haze of quiet observation. I noticed Vanessa's habits more closely now. She filmed herself twice a day, once in the morning near the kitchen, and again in the evening when the light hit the windows just right. She spoke to her camera about family life, peace, and gratitude, while Linda and I moved silently around her, like extras in her production. One afternoon, Linda came home from the market with a newspaper tucked under her arm. The front page of the Coastal Tribune carried an article written by Diane Cole. The headline read, "Parents Pushed Out of Their Own Homes." I recognized Linda's handwriting on the margin, where she had underlined a paragraph, Diane had written about aging parents who let their children move back home after financial hardship and ended up losing more than they gave. It didn't mention us by name, but the details were too close to ignore. Reading it felt like someone had taken our quiet pain and put it into print for the world to see. Linda sat at the kitchen table as tears rolled down her cheeks. She wasn't crying out of shame. She said it felt like someone finally understood. For the first time in months, she didn't look alone. That evening, I decided to go through our home security footage again. The small camera I had installed in the hallway weeks earlier was still running, silent and discreet. I scrolled through days of recordings until I found something that made my heart drop. It was from 3 months ago. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. Linda was walking down the stairs with a laundry basket when Vanessa brushed past her roughly. The basket fell, and Linda stumbled, grabbing the rail to stop herself from falling. Vanessa didn't reach out to help. She just stood there for a moment, then walked away. I paused the video and stared at the frozen image of Linda gripping the railing. I could almost feel her fear all over again. My hands trembled as I replayed it. Then I saved the clip onto a separate drive. That night, while Linda slept, I sat alone in my office, staring at the evidence piling up. Bills, forms, recordings, and now this video. My house had become a courtroom, and every corner was a witness. A few days later, our neighbor Sophie knocked on the door. She was a quiet woman, retired nurse, someone Linda often chatted with over the fence. She held a small flash drive and asked if she could speak with me privately. I led her to the porch. She told me her security camera had caught something odd a while back. She wasn't sure if it was serious, but after reading the Tribune article, she thought I should see it. I plugged the drive into my laptop after she left. The footage showed our front yard months earlier. Vanessa stood outside with Linda near the steps, her arms crossed, her face tense. Then she shoved Linda backward. It wasn't a hard shove, but enough to make her stumble. Sophie must have captured it from across the fence. I pressed pause and leaned back, my throat tight. Seeing it from another angle removed all doubt. It wasn't just disrespect anymore, it was aggression. I sent a short message to Richard, asking to meet the next day. He called back within minutes. "Bring everything," he said. That night I barely slept. Around midnight I heard footsteps downstairs and the faint murmur of Vanessa's voice. I walked quietly to the hallway and listened. She was in the living room, speaking on the phone, her voice calm, deliberate. "Yes, Mark," she said. "I want everything formalized. The sooner we have proof of occupancy, the better." There was a pause, then she laughed softly. "Of course they have no idea. We just need the right paperwork to remove them from the title later." I stepped back, heart pounding. She was talking to someone named Mark, and from the way she spoke, it was clear he was advising her. "A lawyer." I moved closer to the doorframe and started recording on my phone, keeping my breath steady. She continued, her tone almost cheerful. "Once everything is transferred, they can't legally kick us out without a lengthy process. It's the law." "Mark, you said that yourself." The conversation lasted a few more minutes, mostly about forms and timing. When it ended, she turned off the lamp and went upstairs. I stayed where I was, gripping the phone, my palms damp. For the first time, I had proof of her intent, her voice admitting it, but the victory felt hollow. I didn't want to win. I wanted my family back, my home back, the peace that used to fill these walls. When I returned to bed, Linda stirred and asked if I was all right. I told her everything would be fine soon. She smiled faintly, trusting me the way she always had, and drifted back to sleep. I lay awake until dawn, the phone still in my hand, watching the gray light seep through the curtains. The house was silent except for the sound of the waves, calm and steady, indifferent to what was happening inside. I knew the next step would change everything. Once I handed those recordings and documents to Richard, there would be no going back. Vanessa had built her case, but now I had mine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to resolve, though it carried the bitter taste of war. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. By the time the sun rose over the cliffs, I knew what I had to do. The evidence was there, lined up in folders on my desk, like soldiers ready for duty. The phone recording, the printed transfers, the security footage from Sophie's camera. It was all too real now. I stared at the stack for a long time, wondering how my own family had become something I needed to defend myself against. Linda came downstairs, still in her robe, and stopped when she saw the papers. She didn't ask questions. She just stood beside me and said softly that maybe it was time. I nodded. There was no need for more words. I called for everyone to meet in the living room that afternoon. The air felt heavy even before they arrived. I set the documents neatly on the coffee table, a small flash drive resting beside them. The waves outside were calm, almost mocking in their steadiness. Vanessa was the first to walk in, holding Ethan on her hip. She looked from me to the table, then to Linda, who sat quietly on the edge of the couch. Michael followed a moment later, his face unreadable, his phone still in his hand as if he wanted to be anywhere else. I waited until the room was silent before speaking. "There are things we need to talk about," I said. Vanessa smiled, that same careful smile she always used when she wanted to control the mood. "Of course, Henry, what's going on?" I pointed to the papers. "These are all the accounts for this house, the ones you changed." She blinked, feigning surprise. "I didn't change anything without permission. I was just helping you manage the house better." Linda lifted her head. Her voice was quiet but sharp. "By pushing me to the ground and removing our names from our bills." Vanessa's face hardened, the mask cracking just slightly. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said quickly. I picked up the flash drive and plugged it into the small TV. The screen flickered before showing the footage Sophie had given me. Vanessa and Linda stood outside near the steps. Then came the shove, brief but undeniable. Linda stumbled, catching herself against the railing. Michael's eyes went wide. He turned to Vanessa. "What is this?" She didn't answer. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I paused the video and let the silence stretch. Linda spoke again, her tone even softer this time. "You could have hurt me." Vanessa's composure finally cracked. Her voice trembled as she said she never meant to, that things had gotten out of hand, that she was only trying to protect her family. She looked at Michael when she said it, not me. I looked at her steadily. "Protecting your family doesn't mean destroying someone else's," I said. Her hands began to shake. She sat down on the couch, the color draining from her face. I could see her mind racing, searching for something to hold on to. Michael finally spoke, his voice thin. "Vanessa, tell me this isn't true." She didn't answer. He looked at me, then at the documents. "What are all these?" he asked. I told him they were the utility transfers, the credit charges, the mail forwarding requests, and the recording of her phone call with her lawyer. The words hit him like stones. He stared at the stack of papers, his hand trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. Every form had Vanessa's name printed clearly, her signature neat and deliberate. Vanessa stood abruptly, tears in her eyes. "You don't understand," she said. "I did it for us. For this family. We were drowning in debt. I thought if we could stabilize, make this house legally safe for us, everything would be better." "No," I said quietly. "You did it for yourself. You wanted control. That isn't family, Vanessa. That's possession." She wiped her tears angrily. "You think I wanted this. You left everything to rot. The bills, the maintenance, the house itself. I just took charge. Someone had to." Linda looked up at her, her voice steady and filled with sorrow. "Taking charge doesn't mean taking everything, Vanessa." The baby began to cry, his small voice breaking the tension for a moment. Michael lifted him gently and handed him to Linda, who held him close without saying a word. Vanessa sat back down, deflated. The fight was gone from her eyes now, replaced by exhaustion. Michael stared at her for a long time before speaking again. "How could you do this to them?" I waited for an answer that never came. I gathered the papers into a folder and held them in my hands. Vanessa watched as I closed the latch, her eyes following every movement. "I'm not going to argue anymore," I said. "I'm giving all of this to Richard. The law will handle it now." She laughed quietly, bitterly. "You'd take me to court." "Your own daughter-in-law?" I looked her in the eye. "You made that choice when you tried to take what wasn't yours." Michael said nothing. He just sat there, holding his head in his hands. Later that evening, I drove into town to meet Richard at his office. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of Pacific Grove. When I walked in, he was already waiting with a file open on his desk. I placed the folder and the flash drive in front of him. He listened as I explained everything, every detail from the past few months, every document, every word I had recorded. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Pursue justice, not revenge," he said. "You've already done the hardest part. Now let the law speak for you." I left his office just as the last light faded from the sky. The air smelled of salt and fog. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Not peace, not yet, but a sense of direction. When I got home, the house was quiet. Vanessa's things were packed in boxes near the stairs. Michael sat in the living room with his son asleep in his arms. He didn't look up when I walked in. I sat down across from him, the sound of the waves faint in the background. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad." I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The house that had once been filled with laughter was silent again, but this time, the silence didn't hurt. It was the sound of truth settling in, heavy and unmovable, like the tide that never stops returning. Chapter 7. The Trial in Monterey. The morning of the hearing came with a gray sky that hung low over the Monterey coast. The courthouse stood quiet and sterile, its marble steps slick from ocean mist. I walked beside Linda, our footsteps echoing against the stone floor inside. She held my arm, steady but nervous. Richard met us near the entrance, his briefcase in hand, calm as always. The Monterey County courtroom was bright but cold, its walls too white, the air too clean. It smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. People spoke in low tones, the shuffle of files and distant hum of conversation filling the room. When we sat down at the table, I looked across and saw Vanessa with her attorney, Mark Jensen. She wore a pale suit, her hair tied back neatly, her eyes fixed on the table. Michael sat behind us, holding Ethan on his lap. The little boy played quietly with a small wooden car. When the bailiff announced the start of the session, everyone stood. Judge Naomi Peterson entered, tall, silver-haired, with an expression that left no room for sympathy or performance. She called for silence, and the sound of her gavel rang sharp across the room. Richard began by presenting the sequence of events in a calm, factual tone. He laid out the transfers, the recordings, and the documents showing Vanessa's attempts to claim the house. Each piece of evidence had its own small sound as it hit the desk, a soft thud that seemed to echo through me. I sat still, listening, trying not to show the storm inside. Mark Jensen countered, his voice smooth, practiced. He said Vanessa had been managing the household finances out of necessity, that she was taking initiative for a family too passive to manage its own affairs. He argued that there was no malicious intent, only confusion and overreach. He smiled often, as if trying to charm the truth into submission. Richard didn't raise his voice once. He played the phone recording. Vanessa's own words filled the courtroom. "We just need the right paperwork to remove them from the title later." The room went still. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, pen paused in her hand. Richard then called Sophie Delgado to the stand. Sophie was nervous but firm, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She testified about what she had seen and presented the footage from her security camera. On the screen, Vanessa's shove looked even more deliberate than I remembered. Linda closed her eyes. When the video ended, Vanessa whispered something to her attorney, then looked toward the judge. Her face was tight, pale. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, but instead she burst out, her voice sharp and shaking. "They set me up. This is all edited. They're trying to ruin me." The judge banged her gavel once, the sound cutting through the room. "Mrs. Hart-Wallace, please compose yourself. This is not a stage." Vanessa sank back into her chair, breathing fast. Mark Jensen leaned toward her, whispering something, but she brushed him off. Richard continued quietly, showing the written statements, the signed utility transfers, and the false forwarding forms. Every document was clean, undeniable. It was all there in black and white. Michael hadn't spoken a word yet. He sat behind us, head down, his hands clasped tightly together. When Richard finished, there was a long silence. The judge turned to Vanessa. "Hart-Wallace, do you wish to respond to these accusations?" Vanessa hesitated, her lips trembling. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I was trying to protect my son, my family. They misunderstood me." The judge waited, her eyes steady. "Protecting your family does not include falsifying records or claiming ownership of property that isn't yours," she said. Then, quietly, from behind me, Michael's voice broke through the silence. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge nodded. Michael stood up, his voice steadier than I had ever heard it. "I didn't know what Vanessa was doing until I saw the evidence. I love her, but I can't defend what she did. I'm filing for divorce and full custody of our son." Gasps rippled through the room. Vanessa turned toward him, disbelief on her face. "You can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. Michael didn't respond. He just looked at me for a brief second, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. Clarity. The judge nodded solemnly, then looked down at the papers in front of her. After a few minutes of review, she lifted her gaze. "This court finds Mrs. Hart-Wallace guilty of fraud and falsification of documents relating to property and residency. The sentence is 18 months probation, a 1-year restriction on online business activities, and mandatory removal from the Wallace residence within 10 days. Linda let out a quiet sigh beside me. Part relief, part grief. Vanessa sat still, staring at nothing. Her lawyer leaned in to speak, but she didn't move. As we left the courtroom, the air outside felt heavier than it should have. The sky had cleared, but the wind carried the chill of the sea. Reporters waited near the steps, their cameras ready. One of them called out something about the Monterey greed case. I ignored it. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder and said softly, "Justice doesn't need anger, it needs truth." I nodded, feeling the words settle deep inside me. Linda and I walked down the courthouse steps together, her hand in mine. Michael followed behind us, holding Ethan close against his shoulder. The boy's small voice carried in the wind, asking when they could go home. Home. The word felt fragile, like something you could hold too tightly and break without meaning to. When we reached the parking lot, I looked back once at the courthouse. Its windows caught the sunlight, cold and bright. Inside those walls, the truth had been spoken out loud, and for the first time in a long while, it was enough. We drove back along the coast in silence, the ocean beside us glimmering under the late afternoon light. The tide rolled in steady and sure, the same as it always had, reminding me that even after the worst storms, the sea always finds its way back to calm. Chapter 8. Karma and Calm After the Storm. 3 months passed, and the house by the sea began to breathe again. The air felt lighter, the silence no longer tense but peaceful, filled with the sounds of gulls and the steady rhythm of waves brushing the shore. Linda started leaving the windows open again, letting the ocean breeze move through every room. For the first time in years, the house smelled like salt, soap, and fresh flowers instead of anxiety. Michael stayed with us, this time as a tenant rather than a dependent. It was his idea. He said he needed to earn back something that could not be measured in money. He paid rent every month, helped repair the broken porch rail, and spent long evenings talking with me on the deck, both of us wrapped in the quiet kind of forgiveness that doesn't need to be spoken out loud. He called it redemption, but to me, it was simply family healing itself. Linda returned to her garden. I watched her from the kitchen window as she planted marigolds and daisies along the fence. Ethan followed her everywhere, his tiny hands covered in dirt, his laughter like the very sound the house had been missing. She taught him to water the soil gently, to take care of each flower as if it were alive. One afternoon, I asked her what she was planting this time, and she smiled. "Something that forgives," she said. The evenings were the best. Michael cooked most nights now, simple food that tasted honest. Sometimes he would read the paper out loud, and Linda would correct his pronunciation the same way she used to when he was a boy. Ethan would run around the living room, clutching his toy car. It was ordinary, but after what we had lived through, ordinary felt like a gift. Linda started writing again. She filled her journal with short notes, reflections, and prayers. I found one entry open one morning. It said, "Silence heals when it's chosen, not forced." I read it twice and smiled. That was Linda's way of forgiving, without saying the word. A week later, Diane stopped by with coffee and a familiar spark in her eyes. She had written a follow-up piece for the Coastal Tribune, titled "A Small Justice by the Sea." The article spoke about the quiet strength of people who choose law over vengeance, who stand up without striking back. She told me that the story had touched hundreds of readers. Letters started arriving at our mailbox, not from lawyers or banks this time, but from strangers who thanked us for not giving up. One letter came from an older woman in Santa Barbara who wrote that her daughter had done something similar and that after reading our story, she finally found the courage to take her home back. Another came from a retired couple in Oregon who said they had been following the case on local news and wanted us to know that justice still mattered. Linda read each one carefully, her eyes misty but proud. The months rolled on quietly. We didn't talk much about Vanessa anymore. Sometimes Ethan asked where his mother was, and Michael answered gently that she was living far away but still loved him. That seemed enough for now. A year after the trial, I received a short message from a mutual acquaintance in Texas. Vanessa had remarried. She was working an office job for a small marketing firm in Austin, her online career gone. I stared at the message for a while, unsure of what to feel. There was no anger left, no satisfaction either, only relief, the kind that comes from closing a door that had been open too long. That night, I walked out to the porch with a cup of coffee. The moonlight danced across the water, and the air carried that familiar scent of seaweed and memory. Linda joined me, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. We didn't say much, just watched the waves together. Michael came out a few minutes later, holding Ethan, who was half asleep against his shoulder. "Dad," he said quietly, "thank you for not giving up on me." I turned to him, surprised, and all I could manage was a nod. There are some things words can't hold, and forgiveness is one of them. The next morning, I woke early and walked through the house alone. Every room felt different now. The walls didn't echo with tension anymore. The framed photos were back where they belonged. Linda's flowers filled the windowsills, and Ethan's drawings hung on the refrigerator. It wasn't perfect, but it was home again. I sat down at the dining table and opened Linda's journal. She had written one last entry the night before. It said, "Justice is quiet. It doesn't shout or demand. It waits until the truth is strong enough to stand on its own." I closed the book and looked around at the morning light spilling through the curtains. We didn't win over anyone, we simply reclaimed what was ours. Later that day, Diane called to tell us that her article had been nominated for a regional journalism award. She laughed when she said it and told me it wasn't about the recognition, but about reminding people that decency could still triumph in small ways. I told her she had done more than that. She had helped turn our pain into something useful. Linda and I spent the afternoon in the garden. Ethan chased butterflies while Michael fixed the old swing that had been there since his childhood. The air was filled with laughter again, soft and full. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the ocean in gold, I thought about everything that had happened. I didn't see it as tragedy anymore. It was a reckoning, a long, painful, necessary return to balance. I looked over at Linda and said quietly, "Maybe that's what karma really is. Not punishment, just correction." She smiled, her hands still buried in the soil. When the first stars appeared, I sat on the porch one last time and listened to the tide roll in. The water shimmered under the moonlight, endless and steady, a mirror of time itself. Karma doesn't miss an address. We never sought revenge, only respect and fairness. If you believe justice can begin within your own home, let this story remind you that kindness has power only when paired with boundaries. Stay, listen, and remember that even the quietest acts of truth can change everything.